Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review with Chris Driscoll and Rainer Shea. Today we have, several issues for you, but we're going to start off with the evictions. This comes mainly from an article from, let me see here, where am I? Comes from an article from the Workers' World, the newspaper of the Workers' World Party. And they say that the moratorium on evictions instituted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention expired on August 1st. Some relief was afforded when the CDC extended it for another 2 months, in other words, until the end of September. However, on August 26th, just not very many days ago, the Supreme Court ruled by a 6-3 majority that the CDC has exceeded its authority and the eviction moratorium was no longer enforceable. So we're back to square one, no eviction moratorium. And a lot of people are scrambling, a lot of landlords basically are scrambling to kick people out while they can. A lot of families will end up in the gutter or in the streets, and no relief for them because we don't have the same kind of thing that they had in the 1930s when the Communist Party of America at that time, Communist Party USA, no, it was Communist Party of America, I think at that time, had all over the country had anti-eviction anti-eviction what would you call it, anti-eviction groups that organized to, as soon as the people were evicted and thrown out onto the street, they just picked up all the property that the people had and moved it right back into the place. Very effective. Over time, the the landlords started just steering clear and leaving the people alone. And that's what we need now. However, there's some other relief, like the Congress is coming back, and the Supreme Court does recognize Congress's right to impose a new moratorium if it wants to. So we'll see where that goes. But in the meantime, there's no moratorium, and there's going to be a lot of people out on the streets because of it. Rainer?
Wow, that puts things in perspective, doesn't it, in terms of extent of our capitalist crisis. Not even in the 1930s was it as bad as it is now, not nearly as bad, at least in terms of the organizing institutions that are capable of solving the humanitarian fallout from these inevitable economic crises that capitalism produces. We're in such a bad place right now. And all that people like us can do is try our best to rebuild those institutions. And you could say that this is a bleak sign, given that even something like 80 years ago, 90 years ago, far more back in these stages of our capitalist crises, the communist institutions in this country were actually a lot more strong. But the reality is that contradictions are intensifying in this country and around the world. And proletarian revolution is becoming more of a practical necessity for the masses.
Well put, well put. Next on the list, U.S. leaves chaos, destruction in Afghanistan. This comes to us from the Global Times, and the Global Times says that basically that the U.S. New beginning fraught with problems and uncertainties, they say. The U.S. completed the withdrawal of its forces from Afghanistan on Monday before the deadline. The deadline, of course, was yesterday. Officially ending 20 years of US-led invasion in Afghanistan, and we're leaving the war-torn country with an uncertain future, leaving nothing but chaos and destruction in the country. The US has met triple debacles on counterterrorism, democratic reform, and global governance. And the military withdrawal should not be the end of responsibility, but the beginning of reflection for the US, analysts said on Tuesday. After the massive but disorganized, humiliating withdrawal, a US-built C-17 carrying the last American troops out of Afghanistan on Monday marking the final end to the long war in the US. While the completion of the withdrawal, ending the US presence in Afghanistan, the diplomatic mission to ensure additional US citizens and eligible Afghans who want to leave continues. The commander, Kenneth McKenzie, the commander of the US Central Command, announced during a news conference held by the Department of Defense on Monday. After 20 years of US and Western troops occupation, Afghanistan has been returned to its people. Reuters reported that celebratory fire echoed across Kabul as Taliban fighters took control of the airport before dawn on Tuesday, following the withdrawal of the last US troops. Taliban spokesman Sahal Shaheen tweeted on Monday that tonight at 12 midnight, the last American soldier left Afghanistan. Our country gained full independence. However, with the exit of the US, the Western troops and the war-torn country is now facing bigger uncertainties, with increased concerns over in which direction the Afghan Taliban will lead the country. And also, a more important question needs to be answered: what the US left behind the country after the past 20 years. And the answer to that is nothing but chaos and destruction. And then they go into a long list of experts talking about what the US has left, which is really chaos. One interesting figure here: in the 20 years since September 11, 2001, the US has spent more than $2 trillion on the war in Afghanistan. That's $300 million every day, each and every day for 2 decades. There have been 2,500 US military deaths in Afghanistan. That pales next to the estimated 69,000 Afghan military police and 47,000 civilians killed, according to data from Forbes reported on August 16th. they go on, but essentially they show a country that is that is in deep trouble in every possible way, and that's what the U.S. left Afghanistan after 20 years of being there. They left in their wake a huge amount of defeat, and they will suffer because of that. The humiliation throughout the world, around the world, for not having the ability even to control one country that it has invaded and occupied. Not even one of the countries, of the several countries it's invaded and occupied. The longest one, the one that they've spent 20 years there, not even there do they have the ability to do the basic essentials of governing in the place of a legitimate national government, and of taking the place of that national government. So a huge U.S. debacle all the way around.
Yeah. A few weeks ago, I learned about the CIA death squads. Abby
Yeah.
Martin talked about those, about how they carried out atrocities of such magnitude that it made the Taliban into the lesser evil. At least that's how the masses of Afghanistan have come to see the Taliban. Because the reason why the Taliban has been able to outmaneuver the US despite being outmanned and outgunned is because of the help from these local communities that have been willing to assist the Taliban forces. The imperialists haven't been able to get the people on their side, in spite of how their opponents are an ultra reactionary, extreme misogynist, homophobic organization that certainly does not care about building workers' democracy.
Exactly. And that, as it turns out, is our next issue, our next topic, the CIA's shadow army in Afghanistan, which is death squads, basically. The CIA, 20 years ago, when the United States entered Afghanistan, they instituted a kind of a let's see if I can find it here. Here we go. Blowback Taliban cradle of U.S. Intel's shadow army. This is an article from The Cradle, and it's by Pepe Escobar, August 27th. So it's about a week old. And in the article, Pepe Escobar, who we've mentioned several times in the past, he's a pretty damn good investigative reporter, from Brazil originally. And he goes into the CIA's establishment of a shadow army, which is basically carried out the work of death squads. That's exactly what, at least part of this, there are actually two major components of this shadow army, and that's exactly what they did. They acted as death squads against anyone throughout the country of Afghanistan who did not meet their expectations or their pro-imperialist, pro-US invasion, occupation of Afghanistan. So they ran into a lot of resistance, and it wasn't just the Taliban that they found that they had resisting them. It was, I mean, a large part of the country, because a large part of the country did not like the idea of the U.S. invading and occupying their country. So they got, this article goes much deeper into into the ways and means uh, through which the CIA established this shadow army, which includes about 10,000 paid mercenaries in the main one, and another 5 to 10,000 mercenaries in another one. The two forces are called the Coast Protection Force and the National Directorate of Security. These operatives are the prime Taliban targets at checkpoints leading to the Taliban airport, not random helpless Afghan civilians trying to escape. And these people, the Coast Protection Force and the National Directorate for Security, are the two, basically the two arms of the CIA, set up with mercenary forces that the CIA, up until quite recently, paid to do their bidding in Afghanistan for 20 years, and made Afghanistan into a living hell for the overwhelming majority of people there. The Coast Protection Force and the National Directorate of Security now, presumably, are no longer being paid by the CIA, because the CIA has been pulled out. However, well, who knows? I think they are still being paid by the CIA. And if they're not, who does end up paying these people? Because these people are still there. There's still an active force for chaos. Maybe they get paid by the Taliban and they become part of the Taliban. Maybe they get paid by one of the Taliban's enemies, and they continue in the situation of fighting against the Taliban. Who knows? But in any case, it's certainly a large piece of the puzzle on why the United States, when it did leave, left in such a hurry and left with so much pain and anguish after this 20-year-long debacle.
When it comes to the Taliban's enemies and how they might relate to these mercenary forces that the U.S. is keeping there, keep an eye out for the East Turkestan Islamic movement. It's been rising in this last year, this Uyghur terrorist nationalist organization that the U.S. has recently started declining to classify as a terrorist organization for obvious reasons. They want to use it as a bludgeon for wreaking terror upon China and continuing to destabilize Afghanistan. And as I'm going to write about this week, I'm already seeing some efforts to manufacture consent for the supposed legitimacy of this terrorist group.
Okay, that's a good point that I had not considered, but yeah, it's very likely that in the long run, these forces, these guerrilla, these shadow army, basically death squads, will be pointed in the direction of the Uyghur part of China and northwestern China, and against Iran, and against Russia as well. So that's a real good possibility. Fourth on the list tonight, mercenaries in the U.S. borders. In the U.S. borders, a sign of rapidly declining empire, by Rainer Shea.
At the same time that this imperialist humiliation has been taking place, these mercenary companies have been violating the civil liberties of the residents of Minneapolis, Minnesota, the same city, fittingly, where George Floyd was murdered, where Winston Smith was murdered this summer. It's been two companies. I think one of them is called Critical Response Group, and the other goes by the acronym of CRG. You'll see the article to see what that one stands for. Both of these have been patrolling these properties in ways that are deliberately provocative, in ways that lack any sort of de-escalation strategy, in ways that have involved heavily surveying the local population and randomly arresting people with the complicity of the police. So it's basically all bets are off on who these mercenaries arrest, who they track, who they target, who they profile. And it's clear that this is part of the US military's recently anticipated strategy for bringing the wars home, and that the US military has expressed in training videos, in documents from recent years, that it is going to need to try to bring Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. occupations home, and sending in the mercenaries is a good stepping stone towards this.
Yeah, really. It's an indication, I guess you'd say, of the direction that the U.S. is going in recent times, a direction towards more fascistic police state tactics against its own people. It's an indication of the deepening of this, the deepening of the war on working class people at home, which they have gotten to the point now where there's not a lot of difference between being an American citizen and someone who's a foreign citizen. They've done this to foreign citizens for decades and decades. They've done this brutal form of attack, and basically attacking anyone, any forces who stand up for socialism, any forces that stand up against American invasion and occupation, and any of the numerous countries, something like more than 60 countries over the last half century that the United States has attacked, invaded, and occupied. And they do this on a constant basis. Now they're bringing the same tactics home. We're seeing it once again. Next on the list, guerrilla warfare has key advantages over U.S. imperialism. Rainer Shea, take it away.
Now observed that the reactionaries, the imperialists, are at the same time real tigers and paper tigers. On the one hand, they can deal great damage in the form of, for example, the mercenary forces and proxy Uyghur terrorist forces they have in Afghanistan right now. But on the other, the imperialists have key weaknesses that have resulted in them losing a lot of the control that they would have wanted to have. The Taliban has been able to defeat them through the reality that the imperialists are detached from the masses. Washington has learned, or at least history has attempted to make Washington learn, that it cannot control entire countries through sheer terror. That's not the way that human beings behave. That's not the way that sociology and anthropology works. Of course, the local masses in places like Afghanistan, Vietnam, and so on are going to defy the illegal foreign occupiers. Evidently, even if it means having to settle for a reactionary regime like the Taliban, that's how much the imperialists have shot themselves in the foot in occupation attempts like these. And we're going to continue seeing this in places like, say, Colombia, where a branch of the FARC guerrillas has been steadily, but steadily growing. It's been gaining the perceived legitimacy of the masses it so far holds jurisdiction over. It's been winning some territory from the tyrannical neo-colonial settler capitalist regime in Colombia, which parallels how the Houthis in Yemen have been able to defy the odds, defy the great military superiority that the Saudi coalition has by simply pointing to the massive atrocities that the Saudi coalition is carrying out. The Saudi Washington-Israeli coalition, with their perpetual plots to undermine the interests of the masses, manufacture one of the world's greatest humanitarian crises in Yemen. And the Houthis have been able to leverage this towards striking an increasing number of victories. So this is the key weakness that the imperialists have up against the forces of guerrilla warfare. The very nature of the existence of an empire makes it inevitable that a great number of people are going to see them as illegitimate. Exactly.
Yeah, this is an indicator of the weakening over time of the U.S. Imperialist project worldwide. Less and less people around the world buy into this project. Less and less people support it, and as a result, more and also, of course, more and more people are directly confronting it. And as a result, the U.S. imperialist project is not as strong as it once was. And that's something that we hope we can see a great deal of in the future, a greater amount more in the future. Next on the list, Xinjiang Uyghur propaganda mirrors NATO's Yugoslav narratives. This is by Rainer Shea. Take it away, Rainer.
The objective of the CIA operatives who carried out all of these psychological operations in Yugoslavia throughout the 1990s, starting from what I can tell, at least as early as 1991, was to scapegoat Serbia, to create the sense that the Serbs were to blame for all of the conflict, all the atrocities, all the ethnic tensions that were at play in this region and that seemingly are still at play. And the CIA, former CIA operative Robert Bayer, admitted to this in an interview in 2015. He confessed that the Serbs were their primary target for scapegoating, for propaganda. Their goal was to paint the socialist government of Milosevic as a genocidal fascist regime that needed to be overthrown in order for the alleged genocide against the Bosnians to end. And this so much parallels the narrative we're being fed about Xinjiang and China right now, which portrays the CPC, the Communist Party of China, as to blame for all of the tensions, all the unrest, all the terrorism within Central Eurasia. This is the narrative we're going to see be exploited to manufacture consent, as I said, for the East Turkestan Islamic movement and its terroristic operations. It directly in parallel to how they manufactured consent for the breakup of Yugoslavia, the dissolution of the last bastion of European socialism. However, in the case of China, the socialist state is too strong for the imperialists to realistically destroy it through this balkanization model. But it is something to note. It is something to resist, this narrative that the socialist state in question is committing genocide.
All right, next on the list and final, meet the US government-backed regime change guru, Gene Sharp, mastermind of soft coups, by Max Blumenthal. In this article appeared in the Gray Zone, August 17th. Max Blumenthal discusses the US government-backed regime change guru, Gene Sharp, with scholar Marcy Smith-Parenti. They talked about Sharp's NED-funded Albert Einstein Institution, his explicitly neoliberal pro-corporate and pro-imperialist politics, and the manuals he wrote teaching people how to do so-called color revolutions or soft coups against Washington's targets, from Yugoslavia to Venezuela to Hong Kong. This has been going on for hell. Yugoslavia took place in the late 90s, and throughout the 90s. So that's 20 to 30 years ago. This guy, a lot of leftists actually support this guy because he talks about nonviolent change. But his nonviolent change is a virulent form of anti-communism, a virulent form of regime change against any socialist country. And there have been many that he has helped to take down through his non-violent forms of operation. You can read this article at the Gray Zone. It's by Max Blumenthal, who's one of the two founders of the Gray Zone. And once again, it's entitled Meet the Strategists Behind the US Regime Change Operations. Meet US government-backed regime change guru, Gene Sharp. Well, Sharp died 2 years ago, and he's been active for many, many years prior to that. and his anti-communist, anti-Soviet, anti-socialist, anti-people forms of nonviolent activism and protest continue on without him. There's a couple of, actually another article that I want to bring to your attention that's by Marcy Smith. And it is an article in nonsite.org, May 10th, 2019, called Change Agent, Gene Sharp's Neoliberal Violence, Part 1. And she has a Part 2 to go with it. But Gene Sharp, the Machiavelli of nonviolence, has been fairly described as the most influential American political figure you've never heard of. Sharp, who passed away in January 2018, was a beloved yet mysterious intellectual giant of nonviolent protest movements, and the father of the whole field of study of strategic nonviolent action. Over his career, he wrote more than 20 books about nonviolent action and social movements. His how-to pamphlets on nonviolent revolution from dictatorship to democracy has been translated to over 30 languages and is cited by protest movements around the world. In the US, his ideas are widely promoted through activist training programs and by scholars of nonviolence, and have been used by nearly every major protest movement in the last 40 years. For those contributions, Sharp has been praised by progressive heavyweights like Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky, nominated for the Nobel Prize 4 times, compared to Gandhi, and cast as a lonely prophet of peace, champion of the downtrodden, and friend of the left. Gene Sharp's influence on US activist left and social movements abroad has been significant, but he is better understood as one of the most important US defense intellectuals of the Cold War, an early neoliberal theorist concerned with supposedly inherent violence of the centralized states, and a quiet but vital counsel to anti-communist forces in the socialist world in the 1980s, from the 1980s onward. So she goes on talking about some of the more nefarious forms of the US color revolution side of Gene Sharp, and how he helped to carry out color revolutions around the world. And these color revolutions, by the way, sometimes they were nonviolent, but usually they were not. In fact, for example, in the color revolution in the the Ukraine in 2014, the tactics that the CIA employed as part of Gene Sharp's color revolution playbook included having sharpshooters on the rooftops of high rises overlooking the Maidan, the Maidan protests, and randomly shooting into the crowds. And then, of course, later on, blaming this on the Ukrainian police forces instead of where it really belonged, which was on the CIA. That's an example. And that's not just some, wild ass claim that I make. That is well established by now that the CIA was at the center of these shootings from above. And they didn't care whether they shot their own people or the other side. They did it as a way to then blame the Ukrainian state for these kinds of actions. And it was part of the reason that the Ukrainian state ended up falling in 2014 to these non-violent forces that Gene Sharp pushes. So there you have it, at least some of the sides of change agent Gene Sharp neoliberal violence.
Yes, there's quite a lot of contradictions to be found in these kinds of social movements that Gene Sharp has helped foment. Like, for instance, the movement to take down the Soviet Union. There was, in fact, quite a lot of violence to the level of the military getting involved. There was so much bloodshed and property destruction entailed in that transition of power. It was not some peaceful thing, and that's because when you try to take down a socialist government, then a lot of people are inevitably going to get hurt, not just with bloodshed, but in terms of their lifestyles. The fall of the Soviet bloc was one of the 20th century's greatest losses for the living standards of the working class globally. So many people lost their lifestyles, the opportunities that they had, and it's really incredible how this idea that created this rollback for working class gains in the Soviet bloc has essentially been replicated within the groupthink of the mainstream U.S. left.
Yeah, very well put. Okay, that's it for us for tonight. And first of all, I want to thank Rainer for the great contribution you always make. Thank the audience, the listeners and viewers of Revolutionary Socialist Review for tuning in, and please tune in again next week when we'll bring you another episode of Revolutionary Socialist Review. Until then, I bid you a sweet adieu.